We are live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to the people. With us today on the program, as we have been doing very regularly lately, we have another congressional candidate with us. We have Dr. Liam O'Mara from the 42nd District of California. Liam, welcome to the program.
Hey, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting to know you today, Liam. I think the biggest thing that I really was looking through of your platform, there's a lot of policies that I would say are, the common progressive policies, but I think you have a very interesting background that is, needs to be considered more often in the political sphere, being both from the working class and then moving into a PhD in history. What was your inspiration to get involved in politics as your next step, and specifically this race?
Well, I'd have to say I never really considered being a politician. I never thought I would be the face of a campaign, although I've always been political and been involved that way. It had a lot to do with just watching the frustrations build up among my students, looking them in the eyes and realizing that the opportunities that previous generations took for granted are simply not available to them. And that combines not only my background as a historian, recognizing the actual problems that we have in policy terms, but also, my own working class story. Education is no longer a path to the middle class that it used to be. It's instead a path into poverty through student debt and lack of opportunity and, get a master's degree for this $12 an hour job. And I'm kind of pissed off about it.
Yeah.
For me, looking at the district, it had a lot to do with what I thought might work in the area in terms of the messaging and emphasis in a campaign. I do live in what is traditionally written off as a red district, but it is demographically purple, and it is overwhelmingly working class, and less than half the population of the Inland Empire even makes a living wage. And if we focus a campaign on economics, if you focus a campaign around that American dream that is slipping out of reach for more and more of us, there is a real shot at flipping these seats.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. This has been a district, from what I had looked up, that's been in Republican hands since 2004. But beforehand, it was very much flipping back and forth. So I think there is definitely something to be said about it being winnable. And I think your approach of focusing on the economics makes some sense. What are some of those challenges that people are facing economically, specifically in your district?
Well, again, the overall wages have been stagnant or declining for 40 years in the country as a whole. And our area was massively underdeveloped before that. And a lot of the development that we've seen since then in the more recent decades is bedroom communities of commuters. So now you have a massive traffic spike and pollution spike, but not enough development in the real economy for the people actually out there. A third of the people in my district have to commute out for work because there simply isn't anything there. And a lot of what we have been building are low-wage service jobs or logistics jobs, like warehousing, that kind of stuff. And all of that is going to go to robots. So, yeah, we have no long-term development strategy for the area, and that also is a major failing for our representation.
So I have to ask, what inclined you to go to the federal level to be able to bring that economic development plan to the district? Why choose that level instead of going, local or on a state level?
Honestly, and I got that question a lot early on jumping into it too, especially, you're a new politician. Why don't you start off somewhere else? Well, the simple answer is politics isn't what draws me in. I'm not interested in being a politician as a career. I'm interested in trying to solve problems. And my background as a historian, and in particular the amount of time that I've spent studying economic history, means that I can actually intervene in a lot of the federal mistakes that we've been making that drag the entire economy down. And I think that that's where we really need to push a lot more. There are still plenty of problems in California, but there are a lot more people with my views in Sacramento than there are in DC. And I think we absolutely need to start changing that conversation. I don't want to be the kind of person like our current representative, who is essentially a ghost in Congress, never chairs a committee, tries to stay below the radar. I want to be on the House floor demanding changes and presenting a positive vision for where this country can go and try to influence that overall direction.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me that I would want to know is, as you said before, it's a purple district. What have been some of those issues that you've been having when you're talking about some of these swing or even potentially red voters that you have been able to try and champion in your campaign to try and win this district?
Well, it gets back to a simple mistake that, frankly, a lot of people on my side of the aisle keep making about voters in this country. Progressive and populist policies used to work really well in the heartland of this country. And when we actually talked to rural and working class voters on economic issues, we won. But we've given up to a large extent doing that. And I have taken a number of what you would consider typical generic progressive issues, the Green New Deal type stuff, Medicare for all type stuff, and I focus on them a little bit differently. Where somebody in a more blue district might focus on the moral question around global warming or healthcare, I tend to focus on the economics. Medicare for all will put $10,000 back in your wallet of your own money that's being taxed by corporations right now for a massively inefficient system. We are being robbed, and that's money that could be theirs. And that gets attention. Or the investment in green energies. I mean, you point to places where we have put significant investment before, like the space race. They gave us the whole computer age. That there's tons of good jobs out here. If you look at about 47% of American jobs are at risk of disappearing in the next 20 years. There have already been studies looking at the job loss that's happening just right now during this pandemic, and about 42% of those jobs are never coming back. If you look at a situation like that and you tell people, look, I can get investment in the jobs of tomorrow in our nice sunny district here, again, it can get some attention.
Yeah, I think that certainly is a approach that helps get to that more independent crowd. I think there's been a large focus of the Democratic Party, as you've said, in this transition to more of these cultural issues. I'm curious, in this district, have you had to face a lot of those questions, and how have you been trying to approach this very moderate district? How do you view certain issues like, California, they have an immigration concern. You're in more like Southern California. Similarly, how are you broaching subjects like, abortion and gun control? These are all things that I would say in this district, being a swing district, has that been something you just are not trying to touch on at all? Or have you also been trying to talk to those specific communities in the area?
In policy terms, I do have positions on all of these things. Sure. But both of the parties have tended to focus a lot more on social and cultural issues in recent decades and entrenched a kind of tribal culture war. And I am trying to rise above that by focusing on the working and middle classes and on our declining living standards. And across the board, almost everyone in this country is being screwed by the current system. Yeah. So the emphasis is entirely different. And I think that aesthetic has meant that a lot of those questions don't come up as much. It's not the first thing on someone's mind because I'm not talking about it. It's there if they're interested, and I'll talk about it if they do. But very few people have asked questions about any of those three issues so far in the race. When they do come up again, my approach to them is a little different. My framing of them is a little different, because on both left and right, on issues like immigration or bodily autonomy, people make what they consider to be extremely moral arguments. Yeah. And if both sides claim the moral high ground, all you're doing is talking past each other or butting heads. So I try to shift the emphasis a little bit, kind of skirt around that and focus on, immigration isn't what's actually hurting us here. It's automation. And that's, a natural economic process. It's always going to happen here. And the talk about immigration is a distraction from that deeper issue. So let's talk about why you're really concerned. If you start with questions, like what makes you worried about immigration? Why is this an issue for you? Most people will come back to fears about the economy. Very few people will center on the fact that I don't like brown people or something. And those are the voters you're not going to get anyway. Most people have a much more nuanced reason for thinking this is an issue, and they've just bought into a certain rhetoric on that. So I listen to their concern, and I address that concern. If that helps.
No, I think that's absolutely the right approach. That's actually what I embrace too, is you have to just get to that core reason why they're feeling this anxiety. Because frankly, a lot of what I found as a general conservative morality thing is like the fear of the unknown in a lot of ways, in terms of the focus on national security as a major issue, immigration as a major issue, crime as a major issue. economics, just the general market, it's kind of an uncertain thing for people that aren't like these stockbrokers that are trying to manage it. So I totally agree with you that you have to just get to that question of, why is this an issue for you? So I love that framing. The thing I wanted to ask is, now that I kind of understand this approach that you're trying to go at these issues, what would you say are some of those things that you would want to prioritize when you get into office? You've named like the Green New Deal and Medicare for All, but what are the core things you're going to focus on, like the top 5 that you want to focus on when you get into office?
That gets tough. I mean, when people are asking you, like, what's your top 3, top 5, whatever, it's really hard for a what is honestly a policy-centric campaign. But we want to talk a lot more about how it really affects people. So I'd like to kind of skirt around that question, if you don't mind. And say, instead of a top 5, how about a top 1? Sure. For me, it all really comes down to the decline in our living standards. We went from first in the world to 17th and falling steadily. And tons of issues are tied to that. A lack of investment. So there's your clean jobs issue. The massive issues in our healthcare system, giving us the most expensive and inefficient system in the developed world. That's also an economic issue, cutting into our quality of life. Basic wages and salaries, the fact that they've stagnated or declined for 40 years, where they used to match productivity. That's how we created a middle class. People are like, oh, make America great again. Okay, cool. Let's look at the policies that used to work, because we're not doing that. There's tons of these that are all sort of interrelated for me. So I, again, as a general aesthetic in the campaign, I try to draw all of these things together under the umbrella of our living standards and the economic situation.
I like that approach, because it is true. When it's like there's multiple pieces to the puzzle, and all of it is getting to this heart, which is economic inequality, poverty, and bankruptcy, just a general standard of economic well-being. So I love that approach. Personally, the whole platform here at the Hill of Roses is economic empowerment, which is totally what you're focusing on right now. And the second thing, though, is democratic reform. I'm curious, to be able to unlock a lot of these policies, as you've been seeing Congress not really tackling these issues head on. What do you think is the approach that we can do to start getting some of these things through?
Well, first off, I think what we need to do, and some of this just comes down to a failure of rhetoric, the way we approach issues, we tend to slap Band-Aids on hemorrhages. So looking at my district, what are some of the major problems we face? We have a major housing issue. A lot of people simply can't afford the housing that's there. And granted, the housing is cheaper here than it is in Orange County or LA County. It's why people have been moving out to it. It still is priced out of reach for a lot of people, and it's taking an increasingly large amount of their salary. So if people focus just on that and start providing policies about that, or same with like healthcare, education, everything, if we focus on a single issue and only try to talk about something that would work there, you often miss the underlying causes of it. And I would rather honestly cut through the BS and talk about the real underlying problems. What are the structural changes we need to make? And one way I think you can do that, and one thing that I try to do in the campaign is, in a sense, rise above a lot of the partisan political BS, the basic jockeying for position over these issues that lets them fight for turf among voters, fight for money amongst donors, and then not actually solve the problem. I want to see, hey, look, I want to address the deeper issues here. I want to change the conversation entirely and cut through that noise. And I'll work with anybody who's willing to talk to me on those issues. But I want to talk about the real issues. I don't want to talk about, just these slapping on Band-Aids. There are and that's not to say that housing is not a serious issue. Healthcare is not a serious issue. The credit crunch is not a serious. There's tons of things that are really dragging people down. My argument is simply that they're all interrelated, and we're ignoring what connects them.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true in how you can actually address the public on these issues. Do you think that same approach works within the halls of Congress with the people that are currently there? Or do you think that there needs to be, that structural reform in terms of, our democracy to make sure that they're focusing on these things? What do you think is that approach to actually cause this change to occur?
Well, some of it overlaps, because in essence, if you can try and get the public to change its approach, you can help to shame some of the people there into doing the right thing. Sure. But frankly, a lot of the people that we have in Congress are not there to serve the public interest. They're there to serve themselves or their owners. The lobbyists, the corporations, the 1% that put them there. We have a deeply corrupt campaign finance system that has people dialing for dollars, and if they spend all their time talking to those donors, they're not actually addressing the deeper issues. I've often joked that people in Congress should be wearing NASCAR jackets with all their owners on them, because it's not us. It just is not us at all. I mean, my incumbent, you take a look, it's the military-industrial complex, real estate industry, the pharmaceutical industry. They're sending him tons of money, and he's not showing up and talking to us. He won't talk to anybody who didn't vote to him. He won't hold town halls. He does not represent our interests as working and middle-class people. And the way to change that is to change the underlying finance system for our elections. But the only way to do that is to change the people in Congress. So elect a lot of clean money candidates, and that involves us stepping up and sending $5 here and there. But it also involves changing the conversation to a sufficient degree that it provides enough cover for more people who are already there to buck the pressure that they feel. Because if there's enough public pressure for us to say, look, this is corrupt, this has to change, more of them can come on board.
Yeah, I like that idea because, frankly, you need to be able to kind of present these ideas in their framing so that they can kind of comfortably come to that. Because you have to extend an olive branch. This is still kind of like a warfare, but if you want peace to happen, you have to have an offer for them that's acceptable on their terms as well. Not changing the policy, but at least let's focus on the messaging and how we interconnect this.
Well, the key is really is to bring those two together, because what I see is a sharply antagonistic rhetoric on one side about, it's all corrupt, screw the establishment, and then the people on the other side doubling down, and then they drift farther apart and change. The key is, if we can not only elect good, uncorrupt, clean money candidates, but also mainstream the idea that we can win this way, that this is where the politics is going, and then the more establishment types who pay attention to the focus, the type, the whole finger, they take a position once they say 50% supported or whatever. Once it says the public demands that corrupt money leave Congress, some of those will come on board as well. And you can actually get something done. It's not a matter of conceding to them. Yeah. You hold the position. You fight for the principle, but you have to also be willing to make it work for them too, to show how it works for them. And that involves a mass mobilization. That involves building a movement around these ideas.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you there. I think it is going to be an interesting challenge of trying to replace all these people quickly. Especially given the disadvantages that we're at. But you're right that we do need to just kind of also own the narrative. You have to own the people's minds first before these people are ever going to come to us. So I definitely agree with you there. The last thing I really wanted to focus on in terms of your general approach in terms of how you look at this political system is really, how do you try to evaluate that this was a race you wanted to step in? How do you know when someone's doing bad and is not properly serving the people? Like, if you are able to win your race, how do you want the people to be able to judge you too?
That's actually quite a large question. There's quite a few different pieces to that I'd like to hit. So thinking of the district, how it's not being served and what I would do differently. One key difference between me and the incumbent is that he honestly does not care what the voters think. What he cares about is the money that he can draw in and then just advertising. And as long as he can chase the same basic core of people and put out his TV and radio ads, he thinks that he's safe, which means that he literally turns down requests for comment. There's just bazillions of questions asked him on social media. He responds to none of them. There are requests for town halls. He'll go a dozen years in between a town hall. He's been in there since 1993. And he has literally said, if you did not vote for me, I'm not interested in your opinions or talking to you. And from my perspective, public office is about the public interest. It's about serving the public. You work for the voters. And that isn't just your voters, that's all of them, which means you have to be willing to talk. So I would be responsive through social media. I would continue to hold, we right now have a weekly virtual town hall that people can check in on, and you can ask questions there. There's a different theme every week. We talk about it. I would continue that sort of thing in office. I'd be like a podcasting congressman, engaging directly with the voters and talking about them. And I would hold regular in-person town halls as well, because you have to be accountable to the people. But at the end of the day, a lot of that accountability also comes back to the questions of corruption. I'm going to raise money from voters, and I'm not going to serve corporate interests. My interests are in taking care of the working and middle class people of my district. And that's the be all and end all as far as I'm concerned. We have to get back to that. We have to get back to public service as an actual aesthetic. So character really matters to me.
So these two things, obviously there's a responsiveness that has to occur as well as, the money aspect. But do you think it's fair to try and judge people on the total amount of legislation, the legislation they put forward, the votes? How do you try to know when you've actually done a good job in your own mind?
Yeah, and I guess some of that gets back to why I decided to pitch into it too. You're asking about the district and the issues there. I mean, given that the incumbent's been in there since '93, he has voted for plenty of things. And I think that we do have to be accountable for how that works. When you advocate over and over again for a particular policy, and in practice that policy is proven to fail, it does not work, then you need to own that and come back around and say that that doesn't work. I mean, there's a kind of basic commitment to honesty that I think is absent in a lot of our politics. So for me, there has to be an empirical foundation to it. We can't just base this all around partisan rhetoric and talking points. We have to look at what works and do what works. And sadly, I don't see enough of that, and I certainly don't see that at all from our incumbent. He just sort of slavishly follows the party line and votes along with them and pays no attention to the impact of his legislation on the people in our district. He'll buy into the whole typical Republican cutting taxes sort of narrative, and a lot of his voters are like, yes, he's cutting our taxes. And they're not noticing that their taxes are steadily inching up because the burden is falling more and more on us. There's more local taxes, there's more state taxes, there's more exemptions that are being removed from the federal level. I mean, especially in high tax states like California, they're not noticing that they're actually paying more than they used to pay. And it's so fact free that if you can somehow burst that bubble, that if you can help them to understand how this actually works and that there is an empirical foundation to all the political rhetoric, maybe we can actually get somewhere as a country, start talking about the real issues again.
I certainly hope so. It is tiresome to see this, robbing Peter to pay Paul attitude that basically is consistent through Congress, where it's, the idea of taxes being cut always being a good thing. You see this in the Trump tax cut. Some of it's, hey, we gave you this thing, but it's temporary. But then at the same time, they'll make the other tax cuts for like the top 1% permanent. And so it's this bait and switch game that's constantly occurring. And I think, frankly, the one thing that I've really loved in how you've approached these issues so far is you keep bringing everything back to economics. Let's not get distracted on this culture where we're divided right now, because you acknowledge that it is very divided, which is just evident. Let's focus on getting you more in your bottom line. And I think that is a message that resonates in a purple district like your own. So, Liam, thank you for answering my questions. I wanted to now turn it over to my audience to give you some questions as well. So the first question I got is from Nelson Orta. His question is, what two presidential administrations would you look to as a historian to draw inspiration on economic policies?
I guess that's an easy one. First off, FDR is a big touchstone for me in economic policies, largely because of the experimental emphasis. They did not know what would work. They didn't understand enough of what was happening at the time, and they were willing to throw darts at the board and sit until one stuck. And in really complex situations, after all the damage of 40 years of neoliberal policies, as well as now the pandemic and our mismanaged approach to that on top of it, we are going to have to think outside the box to solve some of these problems. So that emphasis is important to me. Another is, I guess, the Johnson administration, largely for that the war on poverty, for talking again about how can we solve real, deep structural issues. Issues like that really resonate with me. I think it's about time that my party got back to, the bold progressive agendas that used to solve problems instead of just dancing around them. We need to be willing to say, look, we can solve this, and here's how to do it.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. I think those are two good examples of presidencies. I frankly think it's been kind of sad that we can't point to anything in the past 40 years. That's kind of a troublesome fact, but that's been where all this economic inequality has been rooting from. It's these past 40 years.
Sadly, yeah, in some ways, and it's sad to say this because he was racist in some ways, but Nixon was actually the last liberal president in many ways, at least in his first administration when he came on. And granted, again, he won by race baiting. There's some serious, I mean, I'm not a fan of Nixon, but he was talking about universal health care and originally favoring even the British model to it, and talking about a basic income to fundamentally and finally end poverty in this country. We could have ended poverty by now. Sadly, Nixon is also the turning point because it's in his administration that he fell under the sway of the Chicago School, and that gave us the Reagan Revolution and everything that we've dealt with ever since. So a lot of the changes and policies that he actually made in his time in office set up the destruction that we've dealt with ever since. But yeah, there's really nothing in the last 40 years that says, yes, I want to talk about these big issues. I want to get Americans to dream again. I want them to talk about, yes, we can do this. Instead, it's all these little Band-Aids.
Yeah, and it's very true, and it goes even beyond those that you listed. Like, I completely agree with you. Nixon is a very mixed bag, and there's some really terrible things he did, but he also showed that he was willing to budge on environmental policy. We set up the EPA under his administration. He was one of the people who took our foreign policy into a little bit more, diplomatic in terms of reaching out to China at the time. There are some things where we can acknowledge that people do some good and some bad. The bad was very bad, though. The bad was very racist at its core. The drug war started there.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of horrifying things, but it's honestly sad to note that on a lot of basic metrics, especially on economic policy, Nixon is considerably closer to the center than a lot of people who've run as Democrats in the last 20 years. And that genuinely infuriates me. What we call that the Overton window, we've shifted way too far to the right now, and it's because they center so much of the rhetoric on those social issues, and it does look like there's a wide gulf, because there is certainly on social issues a massive gulf between any Democrat and any Republican candidate at this point. But on a lot of the things that really affect our lives, as workers, as consumers, as working and middle class people, they're not as far apart as people think. And that's a deep systemic problem that we have to tackle.
I strongly agree with you there. Okay, let's go to our next question. This comes from Hungry Country Ball, otherwise known as Grayson, as we know here on the Hill of Roses. His question is, what do you think other nations tend to have a better social security system than the U.S.? You're a historian, so I was thinking why that's a thing. Why do you think other countries have been able to do this where America has started to fall short?
Some people will often point to a cultural issue on that, and I don't think it's entirely right, but there's a small piece of that. There is something of a frontier ethos, the Horatio Alger, up from the bootstrap sort of myth that a lot of people have bought into in the U.S. And the American right has invested a lot in propaganda to keep that alive. So an entirely corporate media does play a part in that as well. There are simply better information sources in almost every single country. We have a free press, but we do not have a fair or accurate press anymore. It's all chasing after particular people. So I put a lot of blame for that on the way we frame narratives. And because of the way the media is structured, that changes the politics, which means that we have a lot of, frankly, genuinely cowardly politicians who are only chasing after particular bases. It's where a lot of our gerrymandering comes in as well. And, people will go after a particular issue that works with the constituents that they want and ignore the deeper or larger issues. So we have to be willing to talk about these things. The simple fact is those safety nets are sustainable and they work. And it's one of the reasons that a lot of if you think about traditional European culture, it was much more class conscious, much more hidebound in the way it worked there. And the social mobility is much higher across Western Europe today than it is in the United States, the land of opportunity that people always fled to. This is where you used to be able to come as a poor person. All of my ancestors came in the later 19th century from various dirt poor countries of Europe, Ireland, Sicily, Poland, and they came here with nothing. And they were able to make something of themselves because that used to be the kind of economy we had. Today, opportunity is falling in the US and it is rising, and you are much more likely, if you were born in poverty, to climb out of it in Europe than you are here. And I think a lot of that comes down to the media narratives and the political narratives, our simple cowardice and unwillingness to talk about them.
Yeah, I can certainly agree with you. I think there is something about this narrative that's still been forged into the media and has been at kind of the core of our country ever since. It's like this American exceptionalism. We are not willing to look at ourselves objectively in what we're doing. We just always have to believe that we are number one. And so whatever we're doing in the past, that must be the behavior of someone who's number one. So we just got to keep doing it. So
yeah, and a lot of it comes down to like, oh, well, that won't work here. That won't work here. I hear that all the time in big arguments around social policy. Like the healthcare one comes up a lot. Oh, well, we're a bigger country, so we couldn't afford that. I'm like, economics 101 here. Economies of scale, it would be easier for us. Right? Anything that Belgium can do, we could do better because we have more people. It's easier to afford with a larger and growing population, with a younger population, than it is for a lot of these countries that do provide better benefits. And again, it just gets back to the media narratives. We no longer educate people. You don't have a very enlightened content showing up in the evening news anymore, explaining the issues and how they work. What you have is I don't know. Am I allowed to?
Go for it. Yeah.
I'm a working class background, so I want to say what we have is a media shit show. But again, I was a trucker in the port, so it's just people yelling at each other, and they don't listen, and they don't inform, and they don't talk about these issues anymore. And I think that has a huge impact on our politics.
I completely agree with you. There's been this corporatization of the news that has led to such a consolidation where we are no longer, having a diversity of thought. It's being funneled through, I think, now like 8 hands really in this ecosystem. And that furthermore, we're not doing news. We're doing commentary at the core when we're calling it news. And now here at the program, we do commentary, it's opinion, but it's entertainment at the end of the day because it's driven by ratings, because that's how you sell the advertising. And frankly, we always point left, right, but this is something that we can point to ourselves on as Democrats. A lot of this came under Clinton, a lot of this deregulation of the media. So, I totally agree that the media has a large role, and that's why we want to have an independent media to hopefully push back on some of those things. Let's go to our next.
Especially television used to be a loss leader. They didn't used to make money on it at all, and they no longer have to. So yeah, some of it goes back to Reagan and the fairness doctrines and all that. But yeah, Clinton's deregulation had a huge part in that. Yeah.
Yeah, totally great. Let's go to our next question here. Nelson had another question. This is, on student loan reform. What do you think the solution is to this? You mentioned that earlier.
Well, there's 2 parts to that. If you want to talk about overall systemic reform, tuition-free public universities, colleges, and trade schools. We need to get back to education being a public service and a way for people to better their lives. That's what it was about before. It wasn't about making money for people or preparing them for particular jobs or this or that. The emphasis is completely wrong. So I want to see us move to a publicly funded system for that. If you still want to go to private school, that's fine. But the tuitions are going to fall in the private schools too if they have to compete with. If the UC system was tuition free again, which it was in the 70s, if we got back to that, it would lower the cost of education for everyone. But I also, and this is a point I like to make in my area too, the 42nd district is quite sprawling. It's huge, and there is not a single university in it. Anyone who goes to university in the district has to commute out. There's none, like zero. We have 2 small community colleges and no universities. And one big issue here you'll run into is I want to forgive all student debt. And you get people saying, well, I didn't go to college. Why should I have to pay for that? And, how does that benefit me? Well, I look at it as an overall economic stimulus. If you forgive student debt and people are no longer having to make those massive payments every month, what are they going to do with that money? Oh, maybe I can afford now to buy a new car or remodel my kitchen, make an expansion on the house. And suddenly people who sell stuff, people who build stuff, well, your local carpenter suddenly has more work. It affects everybody. There's a basic principle that I often try to bring back up, and this is where educator Liam and politician Liam kind of mix a little bit, but a basic Fordist principle that if you have more money in the hands of working people, they spend it. If they spend it, everyone does better. And you can connect that to tons of issues like student loan reform. If we ditch those student loans, the entire economy will improve. I mean,
yeah, just to play devil,
bankers will be mad, but that's about it.
That's fair. Just to play a little devil's advocate on student loan reform, what do you say to the people who say, they took out that loan, they tried to take this responsibility? Why should we help these people that in general have a higher, income, just wiping out their debt slate? What do you try to say to those people? I know you're in a conservative district, so you probably face that a lot. What do you tell them?
Oftentimes that higher income is completely wiped out by the higher expenses that we have. And that gets back to the climbing cost of living for everyone relative to wages. It oftentimes makes no difference at all. My income is not terrible. It's not great, but it's not that bad. But so much of it is eaten up by the expenses of having to drive to the different campuses and, pay for all the benefits that I have to do, and then the student loans and everything on top of that. It just wipes it out. So you end up the point of taking on the loans in the first place and getting the education was some kind of self-betterment. It gets back to that basic social mobility question. Do we want to actually grow as an economy and as a society, or do we want to create a basic path into permanent poverty? Because it's what it ends up doing to a lot of people. So yeah, I try to point to, people took on those loans, but they did it because someone said this would help better your life. This is the way to do it. This is how you improve. And it's not the reality of it. And we have to, again, follow the data. The reality does not match the rhetoric at all.
Okay. And just to follow up one more time, I wanted to know what your critique for the people who would say that this is credential inflationism, where you should instead be focusing on just making sure people can get employed out of high school more easily, or just give them that flexibility coming out. Why do you think everyone should be going to college? Because that is, at the end of the day, the incentive of making it free going forward.
Well, simply put, I don't think that everyone should go to it. And it's one of the reasons that I said free universities, colleges, and trade schools. Okay, because there are tons of things that we're still always going to need that have nothing to do whatsoever with college. Not everyone needs to go to college. Not everyone wants to go to college. Not everyone should go to college. I mean, it's just not the only way to do it. So we do need to improve the lives and the incomes of everybody, not just the college students. But the simple fact is, do we want a 21st century economy or a 19th century economy? Do we want, this is the biotech century. Do we want more people able to get involved in that? Do we want to be a leader in technology again? Because we used to. Why do we want China to be the world leader in solar cell and battery technologies? Because they are right now. We used to be. Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House. Ronald Reagan took them back off. We were invested in this stuff. And if we had maintained that level of social investment in our education systems and in research and development and whatnot, instead of seeing it steadily decline per capita, we would still be producing the jobs of tomorrow, and we wouldn't be facing this massive crisis from automation. The simple fact is, a lot of the countries that do better in terms of overall employment, and this is true not just for college grads again, the German unemployment rate is usually like 3% If you are not able to compete in one area economically, you invest in another where you still can, and you produce those jobs. And we don't do that well enough in this country. We simply leave people behind. There are people all across this country that have been stuck on permanent disability or found some kind of unemployment issue because there's no jobs in their area. We're not investing in that area, and we're not giving them the educational opportunity to find another career. We often tell people like, well, your job's going to, we saw this in the 2016 campaign. Okay, so like the coal miner issue, right? Mining coal is not economically viable. It's less efficient as a power source. It's disappearing from use. Those jobs themselves can't be saved, but every one of those workers can. And we have to give them a path forward. We have to give them a sense of dignity where they actually have a job and can support their families again. And we don't do that well enough. So education policy is one of those areas, but it does involve trade schools as well. I'm not going to leave that out of.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important parts. As you were mentioning with Germany, their ratio of, people going to trade school compared to colleges is basically the flip of what we do. They have like 50% of people going to trade school and like 8% of people going to college. So I think we definitely need to be doing a lot more investment in that. But Nelson, thank you.
A lot of people who go to college too are doing it only just to get a job.
Yeah.
They're doing it because it was a requirement for the job that they wanted. And that's really not the point of universities. So
I agree. It should be focused on the learning and skill enhancement rather than just being a job credentialism. I totally agree with you there. Let's go now to our next question. This comes from Justin Swee. He actually lives next door to your district. He wants to ask you. This is a question regarding immigration in general. What do you say to the people who say that immigrants today are having just anchor babies to be able to steal U.S. resources and be able to stay here? How do you try and convert some of those people who are hardline immigration voters currently?
It's honestly a difficult one, and in some ways, it's an unwinnable argument if you get involved in the ethics of it with people, because some of those positions do dig in pretty deeply. So oftentimes with the person who's going to come at you talking about anchor babies and whatnot, you're going to really struggle to reach them. I do try to steer it back to what's actually causing the problems. And again, start with those basic questions. Why are you afraid of immigrants stealing jobs? Because study after study has shown they don't actually do that. Immigration of whatever skill level literally creates jobs. So one person might lose a job in competition, and then 2 more jobs are created because immigrants have much higher levels of entrepreneurship. And that's something that's been true through our entire history. Going way back to the early 19th century, people who are willing to move to another country and start over with a new language, a new culture, they are self-starters by definition. They are people who are ambitious, who want to make something of themselves and do something for their children, which means they do tend to start businesses. They do tend to work hard. They're not a drain on the economy. They literally are a benefit. And in the long run, they have benefited every single economy you look at. Immigration is always a net benefit. But if your concern is the social aspect of it, for some people like the declining homogeneity in the region there, you can't win those arguments. If someone is afraid of immigration because they're different people, there's no way to answer that. If they're afraid of it because they're afraid of jobs being lost and U.S. resources being taken, there are simple empirical answers. And I try to stick with the data there, rather than, again, the partisan language or rhetoric. Point to look, they're not actually taking resources. They're literally creating them. And if we, especially with the whole question of legal versus illegal immigration, if we solved that, it was artificially created in the first place. We used to have very tiny levels of undocumented people in the country. When we started heavily militarizing that border, it trapped people here who didn't want to be here, who were only coming in to pick some lettuce and they were going to go home. And by trapping them there, you created a problem that you can milk every single election cycle, pointing to the undocumented population. So I'd say solve the real problem. Bring them out of the shadows. If they're here, let them apply for citizenship and start paying all their taxes. And it kind of it steals the whole argument about them not paying their fair share or using resources like education without paying enough for it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. One of the things that I say is the best way to stop illegal immigration is to increase general immigration, because people want to come here one way or another. So if you make it a little bit streamlined to be able to come here as a legal immigrant, well, then you're going to reduce your illegal population because the demand is going to remain the same to be able to come here.
It used to be much easier, and realistically, immigration needs to match the economic demands in the country. If people are coming here, they're coming here because jobs exist, because there is a way for them to actually make money and take care of their kids. No one moves to a country that's going to be poorer, where they're going to be worse off. It just doesn't happen that way. They're coming because there's a demand. So let the natural legal immigration policy match the economic needs, and you remove the whole argument. Again, not for the racist, but that's a whole different question. And
yeah, I think that's the people we don't aim at personally. That's a long-term conversation. It's an exposure thing. You got to lift their heads up a little bit by solving the economic problems underneath, because frankly, that's really like a scarcity mindset. If you're being taken care of and you're at a happy life, it's going to be harder for you to hate someone because you're less scared of your own survival. So
ultimately, that's behind a lot of our basic issues is fears and socioeconomic fears. You wonder, why are some places more violent? Why are some places prone to terrorism? Why is there some places prone to the sort of neo-fascist rhetoric? It's because people are scared. If you improve the overall socioeconomic situation for them, those arguments don't take hold in the first place. We are at this point susceptible to this kind of neo-fascist rhetoric precisely because of that economic decline. Otherwise, it would have no way of latching on. So I think ultimately, for me, it's again a matter of steering back to, let's talk about the real underlying conditions. Don't bother engaging with the hardcore nativists or racists, because some people are always going to be susceptible to that kind of rhetoric anyway. You're not going to get all of them, but it will be a much smaller part of the population that buys into that nativism if you solve the real problems.
I strongly agree. And I love your message, discipline, to always make sure it comes back to the economy. Let's go to another economic question here, though. This comes from a so-called Caesar. He wants to know, should we be trying to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and staying out of China? And, obviously, we're a very service-based economy. Do you think that we need to transition back to a manufacturing society, or do you think we can exist in our current state?
Honestly, questions like that are a rhetorical trap. They don't actually make sense. We today manufacture more in the U.S. than we ever have before. We still are manufacturing things. We just do it with fewer people. So it's a matter of technology changes and automation. And you're not going to get away from that. The focus on China also is misguided because jobs are leaving China at a pretty steady clip and going to even cheaper countries like Vietnam. As China's living standards improve, as it gets a larger and larger middle class, they're demanding more in wages, then there's no reason for those jobs to be there. And eventually they're going to fall into exactly the same issue with tons of automation in those factory jobs, which are going to take that away. So focusing in on China took our jobs, you're missing the whole point. It's like this automation is always going to be here. So we have at some point to start thinking about a different way forward. And I like to take it back to that question of basic automation and say, look, at some point we're going to have to tax the robots because they're the ones actually doing a lot of that work, and instead allow other parts of the economy that are today completely ignored. You know that childcare, medical stuff, education, none of it counts in a GDP. It's just completely ignored. To say nothing of home care. I mean, apparently it's completely worthless for a mother to raise a child because there's no economic value. Of course, there's economic value to that. If we actually invest some of that money in tons of other jobs, other areas, we'd continue to grow. People would keep spending money, and we don't even have to worry about this whole change. The movement toward automation doesn't have to be as terrifying as it is if we can solve the policy issues. So, no, I think for me, trade is an issue in as far as a lot of the trade deals are deeply undemocratic. They're anti-environmental. They give us a kind of unaccountable corporate elite. The neoliberal trade deals are problematic because of that, not because of trade itself.
Yeah, and I think your point beforehand on, the whole China question being kind of a red herring problem is, I think, really apt as well, because frankly, they're doing a lot of offshoring of their own labor now. They've been kind of going into the African markets to have stuff even produced cheaper, get more resources. And then you're seeing a lot of these surrounding Asian countries that have had even lower costs because, frankly, they've reached the point of having a more boisterous middle class compared to what they had in the past and an aging population. So now it's kind of they're transitioning into this service-based economy too. So I wouldn't be surprised if they start running
them too, especially given the whole one child left behind thing and the rapidly aging population. They didn't have they won't have had enough time to build a large enough middle class to really sustain that, given the aging population. Which is, their economy is about the same size as ours, but their population's 4 times the size. So there still is plenty of poverty in China, but large parts of it are changing so rapidly, and eventually they won't need us at all. They won't need our markets to sell us stuff. They will have a large enough consumer base in their own country. So chasing after this, again, it just falls into the whole the neo-fascist blame game, and it misses the real underlying dynamics.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Let's do one more question from the audience before we let them know how that they can help out if they've liked what you've said today. This last one comes from an OG Merchman. What's your views on universal basic income and, a general foreign policy lens of what you'd hope to try and do if you were to be elected?
Well, that's fun. 2 very different questions.
Right. Yeah.
The question of basic income, I've already kind of hinted at a few times. I'm definitely for a basic income. And I think that some kind of guaranteed minimum income is the single best and proven way to solve poverty permanently. If you don't want poverty in the country, give people money. It's not a matter of putting them permanently on the dole or making them dependent. It literally does the exact opposite. It gives them a leg up to solve the problems in their lives and finally better themselves and become fully self-sufficient. So I'm absolutely for a basic income. I don't know if it needs to go to the very richest people. I'm not sure that Jeff Bezos needs a check from me, but a UBI overall as a policy, I think is very commendable. And we need to find a way to pay for it. And a lot of that is going to come down to taxing things like financial transactions and the back of the house stuff that the robots are doing, since they're going to take all the jobs anyway. Foreign policy, I guess the short would be, I'm a principled non-interventionist. I would rather that we have enough of a deterrent that we don't have to worry about anything, but granted, we have 2 oceans and 2 friendly neighbors, so there isn't much of a threat there. But be able to help out multilaterally when there are significant problems, because there are occasional bad dudes. But our constant intervention, it wastes money, it wastes lives. All we're doing is killing people and making enemies. You create a permanent like whack-a-mole situation, like the arcade game with terrorism or something there, because you might occasionally assassinate one terror leader and then bomb a wedding the next weekend that creates a whole bunch more terrorists. So the whole approach is fundamentally backward. I would rather get us back to something we tried to do after World War II, and that was lead with a development first foreign policy. So empower the State Department more, invest more in other countries. One of the things that China is actually doing well now, which is honestly going to help them foreign policy-wise, and I'm not a fan of the Chinese government at all, but they are investing heavily in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and whatnot, and that's what we needed to be doing, because it makes the world more peaceful, everyone's quality of life goes up, and it doesn't involve blowing things up and handing money to the military-industrial complex. I would rather break that cycle completely. That's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of clean elections and campaign finance reform, is breaking the military-industrial complex and the way they dictate a lot of our foreign policy. If we build these weapons, someone's going to find a use for them. And I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, the whole build them and they will come approach. I totally agree with you. One of the ways I frame this myself is, imagine this interventionism if someone did this to America. Like, you think, oh, Trump, dictator, and a lot of people, in how they call him. I don't know if I want to go that far personally, but people do have that rhetoric towards him.
Right.
What would America be like if a foreign nation decided, you know what, we're just going to take Trump out? Do you think there would be a peaceful transition, or is there going to be a civil war, basically? That's what happens. I think people need to say, why do America have to be the global police? If we did this to anyone else, follow the golden rule. People here that are usually these interventionists are supposedly often, these right-wing Christian people. Do unto others that you would want done unto yourself. And I think that's
nice
a great foreign policy approach. Yeah, I totally agree.
This is one area where, and you don't get to talk about foreign policy enough on the campaign trail. I wish more Americans cared about it, especially given my academic background and the fact that I'm a historian of the Middle East specifically. I have a lot to say on this subject. And there are so many places where it kind of falls down to a kind of partisan rhetoric that shoots past each other. Oh, you're just saying America bad. Well, no, that's not really the point here. But some of the outcomes are genuinely horrific. Okay, so first off, Saddam Hussein, genuinely horrible human being. The war with Iran, massive war crimes, the slaughtering of large parts of his own population. But so much chaos came out of that war that we ended up killing about as many Iraqis as Saddam's regime had done in 20 years. I mean, it doesn't actually help. And it creates so many other deep structural problems. And if you base a lot of it on like, oh, look, he's developing weapons of mass destruction. Okay, so we have chemical weapon labs and biological weapon labs, and, we're always developing new nukes. That's encouraging other people to do it, right? That's kind of why. I mean, North Korea wants an atomic weapon, not because they want to nuke Tokyo, but because they don't want to be attacked by anybody. They want that deterrent. Why do they need that deterrent? Because we have them. It's a vicious cycle. I honestly, after World War II, there was a proposal actually made in the Truman administration. Okay, we've shown what these weapons can do. Cool. Let's sign a declaration that says we'll never use them again, turn the technology over to the UN, get everyone to sign on to never have atomic weapons, and be done with it. And Truman's like, oh, hell no, this makes me the big dog. And everything has gone wrong ever since. So I honestly would rather take us back to a pro-development and a pro-human foreign policy.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, just touching on that a little bit more. Like, do you think we should be truly eliminating their existence, start breaking them down so that we could not use them, or just simply make the promise that we're not going to be striking first? I think there is something to be said of, we've kind of already unlocked Pandora's box, and now a lot of these other nations have these forms of technology. Do you think it's just a sign detente that they're not going to be used, or do we have to take that first action of dismantling these types of weapons to prevent their further, build out and usage?
It's not actually an either or question at all. On the first, on one hand, I would love it if the U.S. would sign on to a no first use policy. It actually infuriates me that we haven't. And it would be nice, but they're always like, well, that limits our deterrent ability. Okay. Yeah. But the simple fact that we haven't done that creates a strategic rationale for countries to do it. Now, whether or not Iran wanted to develop nukes is sort of beside the point. And the evidence is really kind of a mixed bag there. But realistically, they have a good strategic rationale for wanting them. It would be a deterrent in their area, and it would allow them actually to engage, in their own region as a major power. The only reason that exists is because everyone else has them. And so you have to move toward a point where we can eventually get rid of them. So I would like to take us back to arms control treaties that lead to steady declines in the number of weapons available, as well as a declaration that we're not going to use them. And because it will literally take decades for it to sink in that this isn't a threat. And in that whole process, the way to get there is to slowly remove that threat from the board a little bit at a time, a little bit less, a little bit less. No, we're not going to use it. We just want it in case somebody wants to threaten us. A little bit less, a little bit less. And eventually, they'll go away. And you'll lose that drive a lot of countries have to build them in the first place.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. The one last thing I wanted to draw a parallel to is, this is clearly a, multilateral agreement that's coming into place that we all have to agree we're not going to be using them first, and then we're going to be starting to dismantle them. Do you think a similar approach needs to be had for climate change? As you know, there is going to be this economic transition, and there is definitely opportunity, but there is going to be a short-term cost that comes with it, and potentially, in the short term, politically, disarming yourself, because we haven't gotten to the point where it's fully more efficient than fossil fuels. We're getting there. We've started to beat some of the other ones like coal. We've been able to beat, and we're starting to beat natural gas. But how do you try to have that? Do you think it has to be done through a multilateral body, or do you think we have to just strike first, do it unilaterally, start changing to green energy on our own, whether or not we have that, international agreement?
Again, I'll say that that's not actually an either or. This is me, academic, gray area sort of mentality. But really, you see a lot of this going on already. People saying, "Well, the U.S. is pulling out of the Paris Agreement." Well, screw it. The rest of us are doing it anyway, and they're going to do it no matter what. And so it doesn't have to be everyone on board. And this argument that we shouldn't make any change at all until India agrees to make those changes makes no sense to me. We should do it regardless. Period. And one good rationale for that, too, is if we're making those investments again and we are developing those technologies and we are making them cheaper, then India doesn't have to bring on a new coal-fired power station all the time. They can start putting in, wind turbines and solar arrays and whatnot again. I mean, they're pretty close to the equator. There's plenty of places where solar arrays, or given the winds off the Indian Ocean, you could put offshore wind turbines and whatnot. You could generate tons of renewable energy there. But right now, there's no great incentive to do that. We have to change the entire narrative. And if we're all heading in that direction, if we're developing those technologies, if we're making them cheaper, and we're also trying to do that in a multilateral way, bring more countries on board, work with them on these technologies, share some of the research on that, I think we can make that kind of change. But it has to involve both our own decisions and our own accountability and an attempt to bring everybody on board. Sometimes, and this gets back to one of the early questions you asked about politics and what makes a good politician, or whatever. I come back to character a lot. You do have to lead by example. You have to walk the walk. We can't sit there and lecture anybody else on something and then refuse to do it. Well, China's not doing it, so we shouldn't. Well, that's not an argument.
Yeah.
Right. That's the kind of thing that people should have learned, like when it didn't work in first grade or something. Well, teacher, she did it. That doesn't work. That's not an excuse. Well, you did it too, so you also get punished. We should lead by example. We should do everything that is necessary to improve the situation, and doing that will make it easier to get multilateral cooperation. They're linked.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And the major reason, I just take this to a life analogy too. Like, think about the first person that goes to the dance floor. Someone's got to be that initiator to say, this is the okay, this is what we're going to be doing. Someone has to buy in. And frankly, if you're worried about like the whole competitiveness point, as I brought up in the question, that it would make us weaker in the short term. Well, if you start doing it, then it's like, okay, well, if they're doing it, I can actually take this under account, and I'm not as economically worried because that's now the new kind of standard. So you don't have that short-term risk in their minds.
And honestly, it's not either. It's not the risk that people often say. We don't. And Trump did this a lot. He's like, well, we would lose an advantage. The climate change things are all like a scam to make us not compete as well as China. Frankly, that's bullshit. If we invest in these areas, we become the leader in them, and we make tons of money. Okay, the Germans have an economy 1/7 the size of the American economy. They literally export more than we do. Not per capita. They literally sell more stuff than we do because they invest in industries where they can be world leaders, and they're selling people those wind turbines and those undersea turbines, and what they're selling this stuff. I mean, Germany is a deeply cloudy country, and they have tons of solar arrays. They're investing in nuclear fusion, which is a much better approach to any kind of fission plants. They're investing, and because they make the investments, they become the dominant world leaders in those areas. Mm-hmm. That's how you win. It's an advantage to us to embrace these technologies and charge forward, not a disadvantage.
Yeah, and that also makes sense on a trade level too. If you're no longer demanding these fossil fuels, these people that are the major producers internationally, they're going to have less of a market to be able to export it because we now are self-sufficient on our own, energy supply. Obviously, we've started to do that with oil, but now we don't have to be reliant on just our own reserves that we have. We are no longer demanding of that, as our main fuel source. So I think that actually, as you said, it makes us more competitive. We're trying to get ahead of the curve rather than trying to be reactionary. Liam, I wanted to thank you.
A lot of these countries that are investing heavily in green technologies, they have positive trade balances, unlike us. So you can bring it back to some questions on like trade and people feeling like this will disadvantage. No, this will literally help. This is how we get ahead again.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. No, it's true though. Like I obviously try to present these things in a devil's advocate point because I want you to make sure that you're the one smacking these down. But I'm 100% with you there that it is a competitive advantage to be investing in these things. Liam, I wanted to thank you for answering both my questions as well as our questions here from our audience. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I wanted to know, for the people that have listened, liked what you've said today, how can they start, supporting your campaign going forward?
Okay, so there's a few really good things that can be done here. First off, my website is liamomara.org. So liamomara.org. Some guy bought the .com 20 years ago. Has been sitting on it ever since. But on there's a volunteer form you can hit, which you can also get to bit.ly/Liam Vol. But there's a volunteer form on there where you can sign up to text bank, phone bank. We're going to be doing like virtual house parties through Zoom, postcarding parties at home that you can do through Zoom as well. You can text bank from anywhere. You can phone bank from anywhere. And we have nice digital systems for doing that where people can get involved. So we always need volunteers. We'd love your support and help there. And of course, people-powered campaigns always need money. So throw me some money through Act Blue as well. There's also a link on top of there. And I'm also very active on social media. So I can be found very easily on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and we have a weekly virtual town hall that I do with two assembly candidates in my area, Liz Lavertu and Kate Schwartz, and people are always welcome to join us in that, throw in questions and contribute.
Well, Liam, I love that you have a variety there. From a lot of the candidates I've been talking to, it's been we're just going to do the phone banking. We're just going to do the text banking. I love hearing all the different solutions. And that doesn't come cheap, obviously. That's why we need people to be going and possibly being able to contribute. I know it's something like on some of the other campaigns I've been doing phone banking for like 18 cents per call. So yeah, it's not free just contacting people. So we need your help and support, and we need your help in donations if you can. Obviously, with this whole pandemic, a lot of people have been cash strapped. So if you are able to give, please do. If you can't, well, that's okay as well. There's other ways you can help. Liam,
Exactly.
thank you again for coming on today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. I look forward to being able to help your campaign. You are in California, so you've already gone through your primary like a lot of the people we've talked to. We just got to help you beat that Republican in the fall. So thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, thanks. We had the best Democratic turnout in 20 years in my district. This is flippable. So, I hope you'll consider supporting us all. And thank you very much. The pleasure's been all mine.
Sounds great. And Rosebuds, I just want to wrap up here by letting you know we are not done here. We want to make sure that all of our congressional candidates that are really in part of this movement are getting amplified. So be here tomorrow. We're going to be talking with Maxwell Barrow from Maryland's 6th District. So we look forward to seeing you then. I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation and support Liam in his campaign. And I hope, you're staying safe out there. This is still a crazy time. I know we're starting to wrap up. If you need that, beyond that economic support right now, that community support, we're here for you. We want to make sure that you are part of this conversation and are not feeling isolated. I hope you all are being good out there, and I hope you all are staying rosy.